The breast tax. India, 19th century. In the kingdom of Travancore, lower caste women were prohibited by law from covering their upper bodies in public. Keeping the chest covered was considered a privilege reserved for higher castes. It was a visible, daily, physical marker of social hierarchy. You could tell someone's caste the moment you saw them on the street. But here is where it crosses from oppressive to obscene. Lower caste women who wanted to cover themselves could do so, for a fee, paid directly to the government, assessed based on the size of their breasts. Tax collectors would visit homes. Measurements would be taken, and women would pay, regularly, for the right to cover their own bodies. This was not a footnote. This was official government policy, enforced, collected. For decades, it ended because of a woman named Nanjali, who reportedly cut off her own breasts and presented them to the tax collector on a plantain leaf rather than pay. She died from her injuries, but the act sparked enough outrage that the tax was abolished. She is not in most history books, but she should be. Now let's go to ancient Rome, because Romans taxed something even more intimate. Emperor Vespasian, around 70 AD, introduced a tax on urine, specifically on the collection of urine from public toilets, which was a genuinely valuable commodity in ancient Rome because urine contains ammonia and was used by launderers to clean and whiten togas, by tanners to treat leather, and by fullers to process wool. So collectors would gather urine from public facilities and sell it to these industries. Vespasian saw a revenue stream and taxed it. When his son Titus complained that taxing urine was beneath the dignity of the empire, Vespasian reportedly held a coin up to his son's nose and asked if it smelled bad. Titus said no. Vespasian said, and yet it comes from urine. The phrase pecunia non olet, money does not smell, entered the Latin language. And in several European countries today, public toilets are still sometimes called Vespasiani after the emperor who taxed p. Moving forward to England in 1696. The window tax. The British government needed revenue and introduced a tax on windows. The more windows your house had, the more you paid. It sounds almost reasonable until you see what happened next. People bricked up their windows. Entire neighborhoods of houses with sealed, dark, windowless rooms. Buildings that from the outside looked like they were designed by someone who hated sunlight. And they were, financially speaking, because sunlight was being taxed. The health consequences were severe. Dark, unventilated rooms contributed to the spread of diseases including typhus and tuberculosis. Historians believe the window tax contributed meaningfully to disease mortality in Britain for the 156 years it was in effect. Taxing light, causing disease. Collected until 1851. The phrase daylight robbery, which English speakers still use today for any outrageously unfair transaction, is believed by many historians to be a direct reference to the window tax. The government was literally robbing people of daylight. Now let's go to Russia under Peter the Great, because Peter the Great had opinions about beards. In 1698, Peter returned from a tour of Western Europe convinced that Russia needed to modernize and look more European. European men at the time were largely clean-shaven. Russian men, particularly Orthodox Christians, considered beards a religious and cultural requirement. Shaving was seen as an insult to God. Peter's solution was elegantly simple and completely authoritarian. You can keep your beard. You just have to pay for it annually. The beard tax was introduced with a tiered system based on social class. Nobles and merchants paid more. Peasants paid less, but still paid. And to prove you had paid, you received a beard token, a small copper or silver coin stamped with the image of a beard, and the words "the beard is a superfluous burden," which you were required to carry at all times as proof of payment. Men who could not produce their token on demand had their beard forcibly shaved on the spot by government officials. Peter was essentially taxing religious and cultural identity and turning compliance into a publicly visible, physically enforced daily reality. Now to France, just before the Revolution. The salt tax. Called the gabelle. France taxed salt. Not gently. Aggressively. The government maintained a monopoly on salt production and forced French citizens to buy a minimum amount of salt per year at government-controlled prices, whether they needed it or not. The price was artificially inflated to somewhere between 30 and 40 times the production cost. Salt was not optional. You needed it to preserve food, to survive, and the government knew that and priced it accordingly. The regions that paid the highest salt tax and the regions where enforcement was most brutal map almost perfectly onto the regions where revolutionary sentiment was the strongest in 1789. Historians genuinely debate how much the gabelle contributed to the conditions that produced the French Revolution. A tax on salt may have helped end a monarchy. Now let's go to England again, because England was remarkably creative about terrible taxes. In 1784, the British government introduced a tax on hats. Every hat sold in England required a stamp inside the brim proving the tax had been paid. Hat makers needed a license. Selling an unstamped hat carried a fine. Forging a hat stamp carried the death penalty. The death penalty for a fake hat stamp. And finally, because we have to end here, the cowardice tax. Medieval England. Called the scutage. During the feudal period, knights and nobles were obligated to provide military service to the king, a fixed number of days per year in the king's army. But some nobles, for various reasons, did not want to actually show up and fight. So the king introduced an option: pay money instead of serving. The payment was called scutage, from the Latin for shield. This sounds almost reasonable until you realize that the money collected from people paying not to fight was then used to hire mercenaries who would fight. So the cowardly nobles paid the king to hire brave, poor people to do the dying they were supposed to do themselves. Medieval crowdsourced warfare funded by a tax on not wanting to get stabbed. Every single one of these taxes tells you the same thing. Throughout history, when governments need money and have no one stopping them, they will find a way to charge you for existing. For your body, for your windows, for your beard, for your hat, for your salt, for your cowardice. The tax code changes. The instinct behind it never does.